Jesus, correct?
Yeah, these are the writings, the documents that we have that were produced closest to the time of Jesus. After Paul, then you have the first gospel that was written, which is Mark, around the year 70. And sometimes scholars will differ on the dates. They'll say, oh, wait, that should have been earlier, should have been later. You'll find a lot of disagreement about where those exact dates are, but you find hardly any disagreement about the ordering.
I see.
So even if the dates are shifted earlier or later, the curve is going to be there's going to be a similar curve to what happens. You find in Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, you don't even have any post-resurrection appearances. It just ends with these women who are afraid, and they didn't say anything to anybody. In Mark, you have maybe one miracle in the resurrection account, which would be this man dressed in white sitting in the tomb. That's it. You don't have the earthquakes, and you don't have all the fancy stuff, that you find in later Gospels. So with Paul, you have zero. You just have kind of a nothingness.
Well, I think he has the three things: the resurrection, the crucifixion, and the ascension. Those three things in Paul's. I believe that was what I understand. The only three references to the Jesus miracles, or the Jesus attributes.
Yeah, he talks about all those things. When it comes to the resurrection, he does mention these appearances in 1 Corinthians 15. In fact, that's the earliest resurrection thing we have. Paul talks about he appeared unto James and unto Peter, and he appeared to the 500, and last of all, he appeared unto me. And most scholars are convinced that those were not physical appearances. Paul never claimed to have met Jesus personally. He never actually went up and shook hands with him. He had this Damascus Road appearance, which was similar to an epileptic seizure kind of thing. But in any event, he never claimed to have met Jesus or known him personally. The earliest person to write about Jesus didn't actually know Jesus. If you read Paul, there's an amazing silence about the Jesus of history. And the Jesus in Paul is primarily this sort of disembodied Christ figure in the sky. He even talks later in Galatians about how when he met Jesus, he didn't say, I met Jesus. He said, it pleased God to reveal himself in me. He was having a spiritual experience. Just like a lot of modern Christians say they know Jesus because they're having this spiritual, not that they went up and shook his hand, right? And then Paul talks about the appearances of Jesus later, which is a very suspicious way of talking about it. If I were to come to your house and then go back home and say, hey, I went over to Bruce's house and I opened the door and Bruce appeared unto me. And he made himself known unto me. And that'd be a weird way of saying that, hey, I met Bruce, and we sat down and had. These appearances are these like visionary. That word ophthe, Jesus appeared unto the 500. That was kind of like this visionary kind of maybe hallucination or maybe not. But in any event, if visions are real, it was a spook. It was a spectral thing that happened that they talked about. So then if you move past Mark, you get into Matthew, which is around the year 80, more or less. We get Matthew, and then by that time we start getting some pretty amazing stories. Started out simple, but then in Matthew you get like the earthquake and the zombies coming out of the grave, and then the rolling stone, and then you have this angel talking. You start to get some pretty fun stuff, right?
So it's starting to become legend at that point.
Well, it's growing, is what it is. It was probably legendary in the very beginning, but then when you go to Luke, maybe 5 years later, mid-80s, roughly, Luke and Matthew were roughly writing from the same cluster of years there, borrowing from Mark, using Mark as one of their sources, because you can see that they both had read Mark, but then they were improving Mark, basically. You see more extraordinary events, and then when you get to John, like after the year 90, almost, or to the year 100, somewhere in there, John is not called one of the synoptics, the three that borrowed from each other. John is totally like different. I mean, he's his own gospel. Then you start finding even more. And in fact, John's so exaggerated, he says, if we were to report all the events, all the books in the world couldn't contain them in the life of this 33-year-old man, right? Which is obviously exaggeration. And he said, but these are reported that you might believe. So he has an obvious religious agenda. So if you put these documents in row chronologically, what you find is a very simple beginning, starts to get more interesting, and over here, whoa, this becomes quite a story towards the end of the first century. And what modern Christians do is they're looking back through that lens of John and stuff, and they're looking back at the first century as if the whole thing were flat, as if it were all, as if it all happened at one time, not realizing there's a legendary growth through that thing, which fits the pattern of the growth of other legends throughout history. And so you consider that. That's the legend hypothesis, which makes a lot of sense. You can also show, as you were alluding to earlier, there's also a good case to be made for myth, accepting the legend from some core story, whether it was historical or not. There may have been a Jesus and a legend happened. There may not have been a Jesus and a legend happened. All you need is a belief in a Jesus. And what you said earlier about how the Jesus story appears to have been cut from the same fabric of
pagan stories.
Pagan stories is true. During a lot of my debates, I'll sometimes use the word template. It looks like a lot of it's cut from the same template of gods who came down from heaven because of a divine birth or a virgin birth, who were then persecuted and killed by the ruling powers, who then rose from the dead. These God men had, it's interesting because most of these God men, when you look at their lives, their infancy, childhood stories, there's only one or two examples. There's never a well-developed childhood story. It's always one or two, just enough to show this was precocious kid. This person was, and they were all that way. Hercules was that way, and other God men through history in that whole area over many centuries. You find ascensions into heaven then, either with the God men or with men God. In other words, humans who were deified later, like Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was a human being, but he became deified, and there's Suetonius wrote that he bodily ascended into heaven when he died. Alexander the Great, within 30 years of his death, there were all these miracle stories going around about him. And so you see this, maybe template is the wrong word, but you see this kind of milieu, this sort of idea, this fabric of, like if you wanted to create a brand new God, and you wanted people to accept it as a brand new God, this God would have to have God-like features to it, or the people aren't going to accept it, right? So what are these God-like features that this new Jesus should have? It better have a virgin birth. Anybody's born of a virgin. And it better be somebody who has one or two childhood stories. And it better be somebody who was predicted with some prophecy, or somebody who made an annunciation, somebody who came and proclaimed this wonderful new person. Better be somebody who did miracles, who calmed the storm. Those stories there were stories of changing water into wine. Dionysus, for example, didn't just turn water into wine, he turned an entire spring, bubbling from the earth, into wine, which is better than a couple of glasses, you know. You better have some exorcisms and some healings and so on. You better have those things in the story, or people aren't going to recognize it as a god, right? And then, of course, some kind of a horrible death and injustice happens, and then a victory over death, they come back again, and then some kind of triumph in heaven or whatever. And Christianity has a lot of that in it. And Christianity has its own wrinkles. Every religion has its own wrinkles in it, of course, or it wouldn't be its own religion. So when you look at that, when you see the parallels, I read through Ferguson's book about pagan mythology compared to Christianity, and he's a born-again Christian. Ferguson is a believing Christian. He went through all of the stuff. He went through Persia, through Egypt, through Greece, through Rome, through Asia Minor. He did all these comparisons through Babylonians and all this stuff. And at the end of his book, he says, so what was unique about Christianity? The very last page of his book, after we've gone through this whole thing, he couldn't name a single thing. Not one single thing could he name that was unique. And he backed off and he said, well, the uniqueness of Christianity rests on whether or not it was actually true. Because there were all these parallels. There's nothing special in any of the stories of Christianity. There's also a wonderful book by MacDonald. What's his first name? John MacDonald? MacDonald. He wrote a book called The Gospel of Mark in the Homeric Epics. I think that's the title, but you could find it if you look for it. And he shows, this is incredible, that the author of the Gospel of Mark was educated, was informed, and like everyone else who knew how to write literature in Greek at that time, he was schooled in Homer. He knew the Iliad. He knew the Odyssey. And what MacDonald does is he takes a lot of these stories in the Gospel of Mark and looks in the Odyssey, and he finds the exact same story in the exact same sequence, followed by another story exactly the same, with names changed and endings improved. Differences, right? So whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark knew the Odyssey. And the feeding of the 5,000, the same kind of a story happens. He gets off a boat. The stilling of the storm.